Superman the movie from 1978 is undeniably one of the most important comic book movies of all time, as it essentially gave birth to the genre as we know it today. However, Superman 2 is arguably the one that solidified the formula that comic book movies and superhero movies would go on to use for decades to come. Welcome to the summer of Superman, and hopefully you can join me on this journey through Superman's theatrical roller coaster ride. In my previous video, I discussed the differences between the theatrical cut and the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. I also discussed which one I personally prefer. However, for this video, everything I say can essentially apply to both versions. Granted, some of the movies discussed will have premiered and came out before the Richard Donner cut was released. Now, I have to get this out of the way first. Superman 2 wouldn't exist without 1978's Superman. The comic book genre as we know and love it today would not be the same if 1978's Superman was not successful. So if those are your only parameters to call it more influential than Superman 2, then I understand, and I'm not going to counter-argue against that. However, between the two films, Superman 2 is the one with the most elements that would go on to become common tropes within the superhero and comic book movie genre. What is a way for a superhero, or even in most cases, a supervillain, to showcase their powers early on in the film, not only to the audience watching the movie, but also to the ordinary muggles within the film itself, by having them destroy a small rural town, or in some cases, a suburban town. An obvious example would be Man of Steel from 2013. However, because that is essentially just an adaptation of this same story, I'm not going to count that. Instead, let's look at DC's rival Marvel. In the first Thor movie, you have a small rural New Mexico town that essentially gets destroyed early on in the film. Another example would be X2, when Iceman and Pyro and Rogue and Wolverine, after they escape from the raid on the X Mansion, they go and hide out at Iceman or Bobby's suburban town and neighborhood, in which destruction eventually follows. And also in Iron Man, the first ever MCU movie, you kind of have the reversal of this concept when Iron Man destroys and takes out a small community of terrorists. One key element in a lot of superhero movies since Superman 2 has always been having an action set piece to display the hero and villain's powers. And considering the fact that most comic book movies are sequels, one key trope introduced in Superman 2 is the main superhero losing his powers right as the villain starts to take control of the situation. One of the biggest examples is Spider-Man 2. As amazing as Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies are, at least the first two, they've always been held back for me because they always remind me and feel too reminiscent of previous superhero films. The first one feeling reminiscent of Batman 89, and the second one always reminds me and makes me want to watch Superman 2. But that's not the only example. There have been plenty of superhero movies and even television shows where you get the situation where the superhero, the main hero, loses their powers and they have to find a way to gain them back. It's a common trope, but the first time we saw it on the big screen was Superman 2. Another trope is the use, and usually the destruction, of the White House to emphasize the epic impact that the story has and the epic scale of the situation. This is seen countless times throughout a lot of comic book and superhero movies. You can use multiple examples in X2, whether it's the opening scene with Nightcrawler or even the ending scene when they're doing the television broadcast from the White House. You see it in Wonder Woman 1984, you see it in X-Men Days of Future Past, and most recently, you've even seen it in Captain America Brave New World. The White House provides a great way for superhero movies to showcase the scope of the situation, and Superman 2 was the first comic book movie to successfully execute this. And I have to mention one last trope, and that is the double, triple, and quadruple crossing villain. Many comic book movies feature a villainous character that isn't the main villain of the movie, but you also can't fully figure out which side that character is on. Throughout Superman 2, Lex Luthor is seemingly on the side of Zod and against Superman. However, there are moments, nuanced moments throughout the film where you get to see that Lex Luthor isn't fully on the side of Zod, as there are moments where he prevents Zod. He comes up with reasons to help prevent Zod from killing someone, and to prevent Zod from just going too far with the situation. For example, toward the end of the film, when Zod has decided that he's going to kill Lois and has no use for her, Luthor conveniently tells Zod that he knows where Superman's at, and that he knows where the Fortress of Solitude is, and that they need Lois to help them in their plan against Superman. However, he also double-crosses Superman by telling Zod about the molecule chamber which takes away Kryptonians' powers. But also, as he mentions, after the climax and after Zod and associates lose their powers, Lex claims that he knew Superman had reversed the effects of the molecule chamber. So, Superman 2 was the first superhero movie and comic book movie to really feature an ambiguous villain character that you would go on to later see in countless movies with characters like Loki, Magneto, the Winter Soldier, King Orm, etc. And I know, you might be thinking, these only apply to sequels, and obviously the first successful sequel would influence later sequels, but it has little effect on the superhero origin films. I would say that it obviously has a bigger effect and influence on sequels. However, I still think it has a larger effect on the origin films than the first Superman did. I previously mentioned examples of Iron Man and Thor, but let's take a quick look at Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the Miles Morales origin movie.
This is a pretty hardcore origin story.
What about the first trope, destroying a rural town or destroying a personal property to help display the powers of the villain and heroes? Well, in Into the Spider-Verse, you get that when they destroy Aunt May's house in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. What about a superhero losing their powers? In Into the Spider-Verse, no one really loses their powers. Well, I would argue it's a modified version, because I would argue that Peter Parker, in a weird way, did lose his powers, because the Chris Pine version of Peter Parker and Spider-Man died, leaving the world hopeless. Feeling hopeless, at least. And then Spider-Man gained his powers back when you realized a new universe version, Jake Johnson's version of Peter Parker, had conveniently traveled or been blipped into this world. I know it's not exactly the same thing, but it still gives you that trope of that hopeless feeling of like, where's our hero? What's going to happen now that our hero is gone? That Superman 2 gives you in that diner sequence. And then lastly, you also get the Prowler, who's a prime example of an ambiguous, villainous character who's not always necessarily on the same side as the main villain. In conclusion, 1978's Superman had an undeniable importance in jump-starting the superhero film genre. However, in my opinion, Superman 2 was the one that developed the tropes and solidified the formula for superhero films to follow for decades to come. Now, I didn't make this video to definitively prove undeniably that Superman 2 is more influential than Superman. No, a lot of that comes down to your own personal preference and personal definition of what influence is and how to determine a film's influence. I just wanted to show how much Superman 2 impacted the genre, since it is often overshadowed by 1978's Superman. And quite frankly, I just love Superman 2 so much that I just wanted to make a second video about it. Thanks for watching this video on Superman 2's influence, and tell me in the comments section down below why I'm crazy and why I'm taking too big of leaps to connect later movies to Superman 2's influence and tropes. Also, because I used a movie as an example, does not mean I automatically think it's inferior to Superman 2. For example, Superman 2 is an extremely influential movie in the genre, but Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is one of the greatest movies in the genre. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can join the summer of Superman as we go from Superman's greatness and we dive into the shit that follows Superman 2 in the next couple of videos. But smash that like button if you enjoyed this video, and always stay super.